In a city where love stories usually unfold in luxury penthouses and five-star restaurants, destiny had something entirely different in mind. Marcus Howard isn't your typical romantic hero. Living out of a carefully maintained 1985 Dodge Caravan, he's a man who gave up everything except his dignity and his capacity to care for others. With just $2.15 to his name, he's learned that the heart's riches can't be measured in dollars. What he doesn't know is that the rain-drenched woman seeking shelter in his van isn't just another soul lost in Seattle's endless rain. She's Isabella Reynolds, the heiress to a billion-dollar empire who vanished from her gilded cage 10 years ago. This isn't just another story about unlikely love. This is about how fate brought together two hearts from different worlds, proving that true connection doesn't care about bank accounts, and that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with a simple act of kindness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The thin morning light filtered through the van's windshield as Marcus Howard carefully straightened his collar in the rearview mirror. The mirror itself was cracked. Had been since he'd bought the van 6 years ago, but he'd learned to work around its jagged lines. In the early hours before Seattle truly woke, he had his morning ritual: make himself presentable, organize his few belongings, and write in his logbook. The logbook was nothing special to look at, just a dollar store notebook with a black marble cover, its corners soft from years of handling. But within its pages lay a different kind of accounting, one that had nothing to do with money. Every morning, Marcus recorded two things: kindnesses received and kindnesses given. It was his way of keeping faith in humanity, even when the world seemed determined to test it. Today's entry was simple: Mrs. Chen from the corner store, saved. A day-old pastries for me again, helped him from the shelter jumpstart his wheelchair battery. His handwriting, neat and precise from his military days, filled the line with careful deliberation. Each entry was a reminder that even in his circumstances, he could still be both recipient and giver of grace. The van itself was a testament to his former life, a life where he'd been a successful contractor with a house in the suburbs and a 401k. The 1985 Dodge Caravan had been his first work vehicle, kept running through sheer stubbornness and the mechanical skills he'd learned in the army. When the 2008 crash took everything else, the van became more than transportation. It became home. He kept it immaculate, a holdover from his military service. The cargo area was precisely organized. Sleeping bag rolled with hospital corners, 2 plastic bins containing his clothes, all clean, all mended, and a small box of tools he still used for odd jobs. His most precious possession sat in the glove box, a worn leather wallet containing his military ID, $2 in crumpled bills, and 15 cents in pennies. It wasn't much, but it was his, earned honestly through a day's work helping old Mrs. Rodriguez clean her gutters. The morning routine continued as he pulled a clean shirt from his bin, wrinkled but fresh from the laundromat where he spent $2 precious every week. Image mattered, he'd learned. People were more likely to offer work to a homeless man who looked like he was trying, and Marcus Howard was always trying. Through the windshield, he watched the city coming to life. Office workers in pressed suits hurried past, clutching expensive coffee cups, their eyes carefully avoiding the van and its occupant. Marcus didn't blame them. He understood fear. Fear of ending up like him, fear of acknowledging that sometimes life's comfortable certainties weren't so certain after all. He checked his watch, another relic from better days, its face scratched but still keeping perfect time. 7:15, time to start his rounds. He had a mental map of the city's kindness, which cafes would offer day-old coffee, which security guards would look the other way if he parked overnight, which public restrooms were accessible and clean. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but he'd learned to navigate it with dignity. The sky overhead was growing darker, heavy clouds gathering above the city's steel and glass towers. The weather report he'd heard through his battery-powered radio promised storms by evening, Bad weather meant fewer people on the streets, fewer opportunities for odd jobs, but sometimes also meant unexpected acts of kindness. Marcus had learned to take life as it came, good and bad together. He started the van, the engine turning over with a familiar rattle. As he pulled away from his overnight spot, he nodded to Joey, another regular in this part of town, who was carefully folding his cardboard sleeping mat. They had an understanding, all of them who lived on society's edges. Watch out for each other, share information, keep each other human. The logbook sat on the passenger seat, a reminder of all the small kindnesses that made life bearable. Marcus didn't know it yet, but today's entry would be different. Today, fate had something extraordinary in mind for a man who had nothing left to offer except kindness itself. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Marcus guided his van through Seattle's awakening streets, unaware that he was driving toward a moment that would change everything. Sometimes, he thought, the universe had its own plans. All you could do was keep your heart open and your eyes forward, ready for whatever came next. The storm hit Seattle like a hammer falling. Rain came down in sheets, turning the streets into mirror-black rivers that reflected the city's lights in fractured patterns. Marcus had just pulled into Phil's Gas and Go, hoping to wait out the worst of it. The fuel gauge hovered just above empty. He'd have to dip into his $2 soon, but not yet, not until he absolutely had to. That's when he saw her. At first, she was just a shape in the downpour, a figure hurrying between the islands of fluorescent light cast by the gas station's overhead canopy. She wore simple clothes, jeans, sneakers, and a grey hoodie pulled low over her face. But something about the way she moved caught his attention. It wasn't the hurried shuffle of someone used to hard times, nor the confident stride of the well-to-do. She moved like someone trying very hard not to be noticed. A gust of wind caught her hoodie, pushing it back just enough to reveal a face that seemed to carry both strength and vulnerability in equal measure. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with dark hair plastered to her cheeks by the rain. Their eyes met briefly through the van's windshield, and Marcus saw something he recognized all too well, the look of someone who needed help but was afraid to ask for it. She ducked into the gas station's small store, and Marcus watched through. The rain streaked glass as she spoke with the clerk, her body language tense. The clerk shook his head, pointing to a sign that Marcus knew by heart. No public restroom, no loitering, no exceptions. In his logbook, Marcus had an entry from 3 months ago. Phil's Gas and Go clerk, night shift. Let me use bathroom during stomach flu. He hadn't forgotten that kindness. Maybe it was time to pass it on. He reached for the door handle, then hesitated. In his jacket pocket was a crumpled newspaper clipping from that morning. Another story about the Reynolds family, about their missing daughter, and the 10-year search that had captured Seattle's imagination. He'd read it earlier, one of those human interest stories that seemed to pop up every few months. The girl in the store didn't look anything like the age-progressed photo in the article. Just another soul caught in the rain. The woman emerged from the store, shoulders hunched against the wind. Thunder cracked overhead, making her jump. She looked left, then right, clearly weighing her options in the growing storm. Marcus made a decision. He rolled down his window, ignoring the rain that immediately began pelting his face. "Miss!" he called out, keeping his voice gentle, non-threatening. "Storm's getting worse. Do you need a ride somewhere?" She turned, startled. For a moment he thought she might run. Then another crack of thunder seemed to make her decision for her. She approached the van cautiously, stopping a few feet away. Up close, he could see she was shivering. "I'm Marcus," he said, holding up his military ID so she could see it. "I know it's not much, but the van's dry, and I've got a good heater. No pressure, but you're welcome to wait out the storm if you want." She studied him for a long moment, and Marcus stayed perfectly still, letting her make her own assessment. Finally she spoke, her voice barely audible above the rain. "I'm Sarah, just Sarah. You're sure you don't mind? Everyone needs help." "Sometimes," Marcus said, reaching across to open the passenger door. As she climbed in, he noticed she carried nothing except a small backpack held close to her chest like a shield. The newspaper article in his pocket crinkled as he shifted, its headline facing down against the seat. Reynolds' heiress, still missing after decade-long search. But Marcus wasn't thinking about missing heiresses or decade-old mysteries. He was thinking about the next line in his logbook, about kindness given and received, and about how sometimes the worst storms bring the most unexpected blessings. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that this simple act of kindness was about to change both their lives forever. As he pulled out of the gas station, wipers beating against the rain, neither of them suspected that this was more than just a chance encounter in a storm. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. The van's heater hummed steadily, pushing back the damp chill that had followed them in from the storm. On the dashboard, a small St. Christopher medal swung gently with each turn, a gift from a priest who'd once helped Marcus find a shelter during a particularly harsh winter. Sarah's eyes kept returning to it as they drove, as if finding comfort in its steady motion. "My grandmother had one just like that," she said softly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving the gas station. "She used to say St. Christopher would always help travelers find their way home." Marcus nodded, navigating through the rain-slicked streets. "Sometimes home isn't where we left it, though," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Sometimes we have to find a new one." She turned to study him then, really looking at him for the first time. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, giving her the space to make her observations. He knew what she saw. A man in his early 50s, his hair more grey than black now, clothes clean but worn, hands steady on the wheel. What she couldn't see were the years that had brought him here, the life he'd lived before. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. When you live a certain way for a long time, you start to expect the worst from people. You forget that kindness still exists." Marcus glanced at her, noting how she pulled her sleeves down over her hands, a gesture that seemed more habitual than conscious. "Kindness is free," he said. "Sometimes it's all we have to give, but that doesn't make it worth any less." The rain drummed steadily on the roof as they wound through Seattle's streets. Sarah hadn't given him a specific destination, and he hadn't pressed for one. Sometimes, he'd learned, the journey mattered more than the destination. "Do you always pick up strangers in storms?" she asked, a hint of a smile touching her lips for the first time. "Only the ones who look like they're running from something scarier than a strange van," he replied, then immediately wished he hadn't when he saw her smile fade. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous." "No," she said quietly, "you're more observant than most people." She fingered the St. Christopher medal gently. "Sometimes running is the only way to find yourself." Marcus thought about his own journey, the foreclosure notice, the nights in shelters, the slow acceptance that his old life was gone. "Running from something isn't the same as running towards something," he said. "Took me a long time to learn. The difference." A police car wailed past them, lights flashing against the rain, and Marcus noticed how Sarah shrank down in her seat, making herself smaller. He pretended not to see, instead pointing out a rainbow that had formed in the mist beneath a nearby skyscraper. "Beauty shows up in the strangest places," he said, changing the subject. "Like that rainbow. Most people walking by won't even notice it. Too busy looking up at the big buildings, I guess." "Or too busy looking down," Sarah added, straightening slightly in her seat. "It's funny what we see when we're forced to look at life from a different angle." The van's wipers kept their steady rhythm as they talked, marking time in their growing comfort with each other. Marcus shared stories about the city's hidden kindnesses, the coffee shop owner who left yesterday's muffins in paper bags by the back door, the librarian who never questioned when he spent whole days in the warm quiet of the reading room. Sarah listened intently, occasionally offering her own observations about the city, though Marcus noticed she spoke as if she were a tourist, someone just passing through. But there was something in the way she named certain streets, the way She knew which alleys led where, that spoke of deeper knowledge. "There's a small diner up ahead," Marcus said as the rain intensified again. "Best coffee in this part of town, and they don't mind if people sit a while. Maybe we could wait out the worst of the storm there?" He saw her internal struggle play across her face, the desire for warmth and company warring with what looked like long-practiced caution. The St. Christopher medal caught the light from a passing car, throwing a brief golden glow across the dashboard. "I'd like that," she said finally. "Thank you, Marcus." As he pulled into the diner's small parking lot, Marcus caught their reflection in the rain-streaked window, an unlikely pair in a battered van brought together by chance and storm. Or maybe, he thought, watching Sarah gather her courage to step out into the world again, it wasn't chance at all. Maybe some storms came to show us the way home, even if home wasn't what we thought it would be. The diner's neon sign cast a pink glow through the rain-streaked windows, its buzz barely audible over the storm. Before they went inside, Sarah paused to pull something from her small backpack, a worn leather wallet. Marcus caught a glimpse of a torn photograph tucked inside, showing the edge of what looked like a garden party. A younger girl in a blue dress was partially visible, her face caught mid-laugh, before Sarah quickly closed the wallet. Memories hit her like waves as she stepped into the warmth of the diner. The last time she'd been in a place like this, really, been in one, not just passing through, was the night she left. 10 years ago, she'd sat in a diner much like this one, counting out her allowance and planning her escape from a life that was suffocating her in silk and expectations. "You okay?" Marcus's voice brought her back to the present. His eyes held concern, but not pity, and something about that made it easier to breathe. "Just remembering," she said, sliding into a booth near the back, positioned so she could see both the door and the window. Old habits died hard. Marcus noticed her choice of seating but didn't comment. He understood survival instincts. Instead, he focused on the small menu propped between the salt and pepper shakers. "The coffee here is real coffee, not that fancy stuff. Probably not what you're used to, but it's perfect," she interrupted, surprising both of them with her intensity. "Sometimes simple things are better." A waitress approached, her nameplate reading Betty, her smile genuine despite the late hour. "Just coffee for now," Marcus said, carefully not looking at the prices on the menu. His $2.15 would cover 2 cups, barely. As Betty moved away, Sarah found herself studying Marcus more carefully. There was something in the way he held himself, a dignity that transcended his circumstances. "You weren't always," she hesitated, not wanting to presume. "Homeless?" He finished for her, his smile gentle. "No, had a good life once. House, business, the whole American dream. Then 2008 happened. Financial crash took everything except what really mattered. Taught me the difference between living and being alive." Sarah's hand went to her wallet, again, touching it as if to reassure herself it was still there. Inside was more than just the torn photo. There was an entire life hidden in its folds, one she'd walked away from a decade ago. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "having everything feels like having nothing at all." Marcus looked at her sharply, seeing beyond the simple clothes and careful manner. "You speak from experience." It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "Maybe, in another life." She pulled the torn photo out, looking at it properly for the first time in years. The garden party had been for her 16th birthday. She remembered the dress, the cake, the carefully orchestrated perfection of it all, and she remembered feeling like a doll in a dollhouse, every move watched, every choice made for her. "Family's complicated," Marcus offered, watching her expression. "Had a father in the military, career man. Wanted the same for me. I enlisted to please him, served my time, came back different. Took years to understand we could love each other without being what the other wanted." Betty returned with their coffee, the ceramic mugs steaming in the diner's cool air. Sarah wrapped her hands around her cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "And now, he passed away 5 years ago. We'd made our peace by then. Left Me his St. Christopher medal. The one you noticed in the van, said it would help me find my way. Marcus stirred his coffee thoughtfully. Guess he was right in his way. I might not have much, but I know who I am now. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the city, but inside the diner, something was shifting. Two people from vastly different worlds were finding common ground in the space between what they'd lost and what they'd found. Sometimes I dream about going back, Sarah said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. Not to stay, just to explain. To say I'm sorry for leaving the way I did, but not for leaving. The hardest conversations are usually the most important ones, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the weight of experience. But timing matters. You have to be ready, really ready, or the words come out wrong. Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not just a homeless man who'd offered her kindness, but someone who understood more than she'd imagined possible. How do you know when you're ready? When the fear of not saying it becomes greater than the fear of saying it, he said simply. Until then, you carry it with you. Let it teach you what it needs to teach you. The torn photograph lay between them on the table, its edges worn smooth by years of handling. In it, the girl in the blue dress was frozen in time, forever on the edge of a laugh, forever moments away from a decision that would change everything. Sarah carefully put it back in her wallet, but something had shifted. The weight of the past felt different somehow, as if sharing even this small piece of it had changed its shape. Betty refilled their coffee cups without asking, her experienced eyes taking in the odd pair, the well-spoken homeless man and the young woman who kept glancing at the door. She'd seen all types in her 20 years of waiting tables, but there was something different about these two. Something that made her pull out her order pad, even though Marcus had already explained they were just having coffee. Kitchen's got extra soup today, she said casually. Hate to see it go to waste. You'd be doing me a favor, really. Marcus started to decline, his $2.15 heavy in his pocket, but Sarah spoke first. That would be wonderful. Thank you. She reached for her worn wallet, but Betty was already walking away, waving off any attempt at payment. People can surprise you, Marcus said softly, watching Betty disappear into the kitchen. When I first ended up on the streets, that was the hardest lesson to learn, not the cold or the hunger. Those are physical things you adapt, but learning to accept kindness without shame, that takes time. Sarah stirred her coffee, creating a small whirlpool in the dark liquid. How do you do it? Keep your dignity when the world seems determined to take it away. By remembering that dignity isn't something others can take, only something we can give away. He pulled out his logbook, its pages slightly damp from the rain. This helps too. Sarah leaned forward, curious, as he opened it to today's page. Her eyes widened as she read the neat entries. You keep track of kindness? Given and received, he nodded. Helps me remember that even on the hardest days, good things happen. Small things maybe, but real. He pulled a stubby pencil from his pocket and made a new entry. Betty, diner, soup and coffee. May I? Sarah asked, gesturing to the pencil. When he handed it over, she added carefully, Marcus, shelter from storm, coffee and understanding. The simple act of writing those words made something shift inside her. For 10 years, she'd been running, keeping herself separate from everyone and everything. Now here she was, leaving a mark, becoming part of someone else's story. Betty returned with 2 steaming bowls of vegetable soup and a plate of slightly stale but warm bread. On the house, she said firmly, then added with a wink, just don't. Tell my boss. As they ate, the conversation flowed more easily. Marcus told her about his favorite spot in the city, a small park where an elderly Chinese man practiced Tai Chi every morning, always nodding to Marcus as if they were old friends. Sarah shared stories about places she'd been, carefully editing out anything that might reveal too much, but genuine in her descriptions of small towns and quiet moments. On a paper napkin, She began to sketch absent-mindedly as they talked. First the St. Christopher medal from Marcus's van, then Marcus himself, his eyes kind and watchful as they appeared in her drawing. She had always found peace in art, even during her strictest finishing school days. It was one of the few things she'd kept from her old life, the ability to see beauty and capture it. "You're good," Marcus said, watching her work. "You see things others miss. When you spend enough time watching life instead of living it, you notice details," she replied, then bit her lip, realizing how much that admission revealed. "Maybe," Marcus said gently, "watching is a kind of living, too. We all find our way back to the world differently." Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the thunder now distant rumbles rather than overhead crashes. The diner's windows were fogged from the warmth inside, creating a cocoon of light and comfort that made the rest of the world seem far away. Sarah looked at her watch, a simple drugstore model that replaced the Swiss timepiece she'd left behind, and realized with a start that 2 hours had passed. 2 hours of real conversation, of being seen as a person rather than a puzzle to be solved or a prize to be claimed. "We should probably go," she said reluctantly. "You've already done so much, and I've taken up so much of your time." Marcus smiled, tucking his logbook away. "Time freely given isn't time taken. But you're right, the storm's letting up and you probably have somewhere to be." The question of where exactly that somewhere was hung unspoken between them. Sarah gathered her few belongings, carefully folding the napkin with her sketch and offering it to Marcus. "Keep it," he said. "Sometimes we need reminders of moments like these. They help us find our way back when we're ready." As they stood to leave, Betty appeared one last time. "You two take care now," she said, pressing a paper bag into Marcus's hands. "Just some leftovers. Can't sell day-old bread anyway." In that moment, surrounded by small kindnesses and unexpected connections, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that running away and finding home might sometimes be the same thing. In a sleek office 40 floors above Seattle's rain-slicked streets, James Reynolds stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the storm gradually clear. Behind him, a team of private investigators shuffled papers and spoke in low voices, their reflections ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. "Mr. Reynolds," one of them said, breaking his reverie, "we've got something new." David Chen, lead investigator for the past decade, spread a series of photographs across the polished conference table. Security footage from a convenience store in Pioneer Square. Time-stamp shows 3 days ago. James turned from the window, trying not to let hope rise too quickly. He'd learned that lesson over 10 years of false leads and disappointed expectations. But as he studied the grainy images, his hand trembled slightly. The young woman in the frame wore simple clothes, jeans and a hoodie, but there was something in the way she moved, the tilt of her head. "It's her," he said softly, touching the photograph. "Isabella." Chen nodded. "Facial recognition software gives us an 85% match. She's changed, but the core features are consistent with age progression estimates." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She seems healthy, Mr. Reynolds. Independent." The unspoken message hung in the air. She's not being held against her will. She never was. James sank into his leather chair, the weight of a decade pressing down on him. The media had never understood, had painted him as either a tyrannical father or a tragic victim, depending on the news cycle. The truth was both simpler and more complicated. "Increase surveillance in that area," he said finally, but quietly. "No media, no police." He picked up another photograph, this one from 10 years ago. Isabella at 18, dark hair falling over one eye, smile not quite reaching her eyes during another perfectly orchestrated society event. His assistant appeared in the doorway. "Sir, the anniversary piece is running on Channel 4. They're asking for a statement." On the mounted TV screen, a reporter stood in front of the Reynolds Technology Building, rain beading on her jacket. 10 years ago today, Seattle was shocked by the disappearance of Isabella Reynolds, daughter of tech billionaire James Reynolds. The case, which sparked one of the largest private searches in Washington state history, remains unsolved. James muted the sound, but the images continued. Isabella's graduation photo, the security footage from the night she left, the massive rewards offered, the countless false sightings and dead ends. We've updated the missing person flyers with the new age progression photos, Chen reported, laying out the latest version. The face on the paper was both familiar and strange. Isabella, as she might look now at 28, her features matured, but still recognizable. Distribute them, James said, but discreetly, and Chen, remember the agreement. If you find her, we observe only. No contact without your explicit authorization. James nodded, turning back to the window. The storm had left the city gleaming, streetlights reflecting off wet pavement like scattered stars. Somewhere out there, his daughter was living a life he knew nothing about. The thought both pained and relieved him. His phone buzzed, another media request for an interview about the anniversary. They all wanted the same story. The billionaire, father who never gave up searching, the privileged daughter who vanished into thin air, the mystery that captivated Seattle's elite. None of them knew about the real Isabella, the quiet girl who preferred sketching to socializing, who felt crushed under the weight of expectations and family legacy. The daughter he'd tried to protect by controlling, only to lose her completely. In a drawer of his desk lay her last drawing, found in her room after she left. It showed a bird in a gilded cage, the door open but the bird still inside, its wings half spread, as if unsure whether to fly. He'd spent years trying to understand. That image. "Sir," his assistant again, "Channel 7 is running a special report. They're claiming new evidence." "No comments," he said firmly. "No interviews. Just keep searching." As his team packed up their files and filtered out of the office, James remained at the window, watching the city below. A decade of searching had taught him patience, but it had also taught him something else. Sometimes finding someone meant understanding why they needed to be lost. The last light of day caught the edges of the clouds, turning them rose gold against the darkening sky. Somewhere in his city, Isabella was out there, hopefully safe, hopefully free. And maybe, just maybe, when she was ready, she'd find her way. Back, not to the cage, but to a door he'd learned to leave open. The post-storm air held a pristine quality, as if the rain had washed away more than just the city's grime. Marcus guided his van through streets that gleamed under the emerging stars, heading toward the small park he'd mentioned earlier. Sarah sat quietly beside him, Betty's paper bag of leftovers cradled in her lap like something precious. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "You've already been so kind." "Sometimes kindness isn't about having to," Marcus replied, turning onto a quiet side street. "Sometimes it's just about wanting to share something beautiful." The park was really more of a forgotten corner, a small triangle of green space wedged between old brick buildings. During the day, office workers hurried past without a second glance. But now, in the gentle dark of evening, it held a different, kind of magic. Marcus parked the van where they could see the small courtyard. A single lamppost cast a warm glow over a worn wooden bench and a tiny fountain that burbled quietly. The storm had left everything draped in droplets that caught the light like scattered diamonds. "This is where your friend does Tai Chi?" Sarah asked, remembering their conversation from the diner. "Mr. Chen," Marcus nodded. "Been coming here every morning for 12 years, he told me. Says the energy is right." He pulled out his logbook, adding a brief note by the light of the street lamp. "Some days, just watching him move makes me feel like everything's going to be okay." Sarah watched him write, noticed how his hand moved with purpose, even in the dim light. "Your journal entries," she said hesitantly. "May I ask why you started them?" Marcus closed the book carefully before answering. "After I lost everything, I was angry for a long time. bitter, felt like the world had cheated me somehow. He touched the St. Christopher medal gently. Then one day, a stranger bought me a cup of coffee. Simple thing, really. But they smiled while doing it, not out of pity, just kindness. Made me realize I had a choice about how to see the world. Sarah unfolded her napkin sketch from the diner, studying how she'd captured his eyes. You chose to see the good. Things started small, one entry a day. Then it became a habit, looking for moments worth recording. Changed how I saw everything. He gestured to the park. Like this place, most people see an empty lot with a bench. I see Mr. Chen finding peace in the morning light. See the librarian from across the street who leaves breadcrumbs for the birds. See beauty in forgotten corners. A gentle breeze stirred the trees, sending a shower of droplets glittering through the lamplight. Sarah pulled out her own journal, a small black notebook she'd bought at a drugstore years ago. Unlike Marcus's organized entries, hers was filled with sketches, storefront windows, sleeping cats, hands of strangers passing by. The margins held fragments of thoughts, questions about home and belonging. I've been recording too, she admitted, showing him a page. Just differently. Marcus studied her drawings with genuine interest. You see beauty in forgotten things too, he observed, just with lines instead of words. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the play of light and shadow in the small park. Sarah opened Betty's paper bag, sharing out still warm bread and the remaining soup. It felt like a feast, there in the quiet dark with the fountain's gentle music. Thank you, she said suddenly, surprising herself with the depth of emotion in her voice. Not just for the ride or the food, but for seeing me, the real me. Marcus met her gaze steadily. Sometimes that's all anyone really needs. To be seen without judgment, to exist in moments like this, just as they are. Sarah's hand found her wallet, touching the hidden photograph within. For the first time in years, the weight of it felt different, not like a burden of the past, but like a reminder that every journey, no matter how long, was made up of moments like this. Moments of unexpected grace in forgotten corners of the world. In her journal, she began a new sketch. The park at night, the fountain's splash frozen in lines of ink, and in the corner, a small note in careful script. Moment of peace with Marcus. Remembered how to breathe. The peace of the park shattered when they stepped back into the diner to warm up. A television mounted in the corner was running a news special, its bright chyron declaring, Reynolds' heiress, 10 years missing. Sarah froze in the doorway, her body tensing like a deer caught in headlights. On screen, a younger version of herself smiled at some charity gala, her hair elegantly styled, diamonds at her throat. Isabella Reynolds was last seen leaving her family's Seattle estate on the evening of March 19, 2015, the reporter's voice intoned. Despite a decade-long search and millions spent on private investigators, Marcus noticed Sarah's reaction, immediately saw how the color drained from her face. Without drawing attention, he positioned himself between her and the other customer's line of sight. Maybe we should try somewhere else, he suggested quietly. But Sarah seemed rooted to the spot, transfixed by the images flickering across the screen. Her father appeared now, looking older than she remembered, his hair more gray than black. I just want to know she's safe, James Reynolds was saying, his usual corporate confidence replaced by something more vulnerable. Isabella, if you're watching this, Betty approached with concern, remote in hand. Everything okay, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost. The question snapped Sarah back to reality. I need to leave, she managed, already backing toward the door. A pair of men in suits had just entered the diner, their eyes scanning the room with professional interest. Private investigators, she recognized the look from years of being followed. Marcus read the situation with the instincts of someone used to avoiding attention. He casually draped his jacket over Sarah's shoulders, obscuring her profile. Thank you for everything, Betty, he said normally, guiding Sarah toward the side exit. We'll see you around. Outside, the night had grown colder. Sarah was shaking, though whether from the chill or fear wasn't clear. The investigator's black sedan was parked near the diner's entrance, its government plates partially visible. "This way," Marcus said softly, leading her through the back alley he knew from years of navigating the city's hidden paths. "The van's just around the corner." Sarah followed blindly, her mind racing. 10 years of careful anonymity, of staying off the grid, and now her father's face on every screen, those familiar eyes still searching, the weight of her true identity pressed down like a physical thing. They reached the van without incident, but as Marcus started the engine, a police cruiser rolled slowly past the diner. Sarah slid down in her seat, pulling Marcus's jacket closer around her shoulders. "You don't have to explain," Marcus said quietly as they pulled away from the curb. "But I need to know, are you in danger? Do you need help?" Sarah touched the torn photograph in her wallet, her past and present colliding in this moment. "Not the kind of danger you're thinking," she replied finally. "I'm not running from the law. I'm just running." Marcus navigated through side streets, avoiding main roads where news vans were setting up for their evening broadcasts. "Running from a gilded cage is still running," he said, surprising her. At her questioning look, he added, "I saw how you reacted to that news piece. You're her, aren't you? Isabella Reynolds." The question hung in the air between them. Sarah, Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her secret shifting. "Yes," she whispered, "but I'm not that person anymore. Haven't been for a long time." Instead of the shock or judgment she expected, Marcus simply nodded. "Explains a few things, like how someone who's supposedly lost can navigate Seattle's back streets so well." A wry smile touched her lips despite her anxiety. "I never left the city," she admitted. "Couldn't bring myself to go too far, just changed how I lived in it." Through the windshield, they could see more news vans gathering near the downtown core, their satellite dishes raised like searching antennae. The city that had been her haven for 10 years suddenly felt like a closing trap. "What you said earlier, about dignity being something only we can give away," she said, watching the city lights blur past. "I gave mine away trying to be what everyone else wanted. Took it back the night I left." Marcus's hand moved to his logbook, but he didn't open it. Some moments, he knew, were too complex for simple entries about kindness given and received. Sometimes kindness meant just bearing witness to someone else's truth. The van idled quietly in the shadow of an abandoned warehouse, far from the news vans and searching eyes. Isabella held her mother's locket in her palm, the one piece of her old life she'd never been able to leave behind. Inside, a tiny photograph showed 3 smiling faces, her mother, father, and herself at 12, before everything became complicated, before expectations began to suffocate dreams. "She died 2 years before I left," Isabella said, opening the locket to show Marcus. "A answer. After that, Dad became different, more controlling, more afraid. Every decision, every moment of my life became about preserving her legacy, about being the perfect daughter she'd wanted me to be." Marcus listened quietly, understanding how some wounds needed darkness and safety to be revealed. The locket caught the dim light from distant street lamps, its gold surface scarred by years of nervous handling. "The night I left," she continued, "he'd arranged my entire future. Harvard Business School, a position on the company board. Even the man I was supposed to marry, some merger-arranged match with another tech family." Her fingers traced the locket's edge. "I looked in the mirror that night and couldn't recognize myself anymore." "So you chose yourself," Marcus said softly. It wasn't a question. "I chose freedom, took enough cash to start over, left my credit cards, phone, everything that could be traced, learned to live simply, to be invisible." She smiled faintly, worked odd jobs, stayed in cheap rooms, started drawing again, the one thing that was always truly mine. Marcus thought about his own journey from success to survival, how losing everything had taught him what mattered. "Freedom's got different faces," he observed. Sometimes it looks like having nothing. Isabella closed the locket. Its tiny click, like a period at the end of a sentence. But I'm not free, am I? Not really. I'm still running, still hiding. And now, seeing Dad on that screen, hearing his voice, she trailed off, caught between past and present. Chains we choose can weigh as heavy as ones others put on us, Marcus said, pulling out his logbook. He opened to a page from years ago, showing it to her. The entry read, "Remembered I can't fix the past, but I can face it. Visited my old house today. New family living there. Their little girl was playing in the yard where my daughter used to swing. Felt peace instead of pain." Isabella traced the words with her finger. "How did you know when you were ready? When carrying the weight of not knowing became heavier than the weight of knowing." He closed the book gently. "Your father's eyes on that screen, those weren't the eyes of someone looking to cage you again. Those were the eyes of someone who's learned some hard lessons too." The truth of his words settled in her chest like stones in a river, heavy but somehow grounding. She pulled out her own journal, flipping through pages of sketches until she found one from years ago. Her father's office building drawn from the street, her perspective that of someone looking up from the shadows. "I've been drawing him all these years," she realized, showing Marcus the recurring theme in her artwork. The buildings, the places we used to go, even him sometimes from memory. "I've been trying to tell myself something." "Maybe it's time to listen," Marcus suggested quietly. A police siren wailed in the distance, making Isabella tense instinctively. But for the first time in 10 years, the sound didn't send panic through her veins. Instead, she felt something shifting, like ice breaking up on a winter river. "I don't know how to be her anymore," she whispered. "Isabella Reynolds died the night I left. I've been Sarah for so long." Marcus touched the St. Christopher medal on his dashboard. "Maybe you don't have to be either one. Maybe it's time to be someone new, someone who carries both parts of yourself with pride instead of fear." The locket felt warm in her hand now, like it had absorbed some essential truth from their conversation. Outside, Seattle's lights painted, the low clouds in shades of amber and rose, the city's pulse beating steady and sure beneath their feet. Dawn was breaking over Seattle when it happened. They'd stopped at a small coffee shop, one of the few places Marcus knew would be open this early. Isabella had insisted on buying them breakfast. A small way to repay his kindness, she'd said. The morning crowd was thin, just a few early workers clutching paper cups and checking phones. The barista was new, young and cheerful despite the hour. She'd just handed Isabella her change when an older woman stepped up behind them, her designer, handbag marking her as someone from another part of town. The woman's eyes slid past Marcus, dismissing him as they so often did, but then fixed on Isabella with growing recognition. "My God!" the woman breathed. "You're James's daughter." Isabella's hands froze on the counter, coins scattering like startled birds. The woman, Mrs. Parker, she remembered now, one of her mother's old friends from the hospital board, was already reaching for her phone. "Isabella Reynolds. James has been—" Marcus stepped forward smoothly, his body blocking Mrs. Parker's view. "Sorry, ma'am, you've got the wrong person. This is my niece, Sarah. We get that a lot, though." But Mrs. Parker was already typing, her manicured fingers flying over her phone screen. "No, I'm certain. I'd know Helen's girl anywhere. You have your mother's eyes, dear." The mention of her mother hit Isabella like a physical blow. Around them, other customers were beginning to look up from their phones, drawn by the commotion. A teenage barista was squinting at her face, then at his phone, making the connection. "I have to call James," Mrs. Parker was saying. "He's been searching for so long." Isabella backed away from the counter, abandoning their breakfast. Through the glass windows, she could see people on the sidewalk slowing, phones raising like a wave. Someone had already posted on social media. She could see the alerts popping up on screens around her. "Time to go," Marcus said quietly, taking her elbow. He'd navigated enough difficult situations to recognize when things were about to spiral. They made it to the door just as the first camera flash went off. Outside, the morning air had turned. sharp with tension. A small crowd was already gathering, the modern instinct to record everything turning phones into weapons. Isabella pulled her hood up, but it was too late. Her face was already spreading across Seattle's digital landscape. They reached the van just as a news car screeched around the corner, its logo bright against the morning grey. Marcus helped her in, then circled to the driver's side with deliberate calm. His hands were steady on the wheel as they pulled away, decades of military training kicking in. "You okay?" he asked, watching her in his peripheral vision. Isabella was staring at her phone, the cheap burner she'd used for years. Notifications were already flooding in as old accounts she'd abandoned suddenly sparked to life. "They've found me," she whispered. "After all these years." One morning coffee run, Marcus navigated through side streets, taking a circuitous route she recognized from her own years of avoiding attention. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "being found isn't the worst thing that can happen." "You don't understand," she said, watching another news van rush past them toward the coffee shop. "Once this starts, it doesn't stop. Every moment, every choice, every relationship gets examined and dissected. They'll find out about you, too. The homeless man who helped the billionaire's daughter. They'll twist it, make it something it's not." She could see the headlines already. Reynolds' heiress found living among homeless, billionaire's daughter's strange friendship, lost heiress's road to ruin. The simple beauty of their connection would be lost in the sensationalism. Marcus pulled into an alley, cutting the engine. In the sudden quiet, they could hear sirens in the distance. "Listen to me," he said, turning to face her. "What other people make of this doesn't change what it is. Sometimes the simplest truths survive, even the most complicated stories." Isabella's phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. "Is it really you? Dad's been looking everywhere." Then another, "Please come home." The morning light caught the St. Christopher medal, sending a flash of gold across the dashboard. In that moment, Isabella realized she was tired. Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of letting fear of what might happen stop her from living truthfully. "What do I do?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. But Marcus, who had lost everything and found something more valuable in the losing, understood the real question she was asking. "You decide who you want to be," he said simply. "Not who you were, not who they want you to be, who you are now after everything." The rain returned as they sat in the van, a gentle mist that turned Seattle's morning into a watercolor of grays and silvers. Isabella's phone had finally fallen silent, but the damage was done. Her carefully constructed anonymity lay in pieces. Around her, like a mask that had shattered on impact. "I need to show you something," she said quietly, reaching into her backpack. She pulled out her real ID, not the carefully crafted Sarah Williams identity she'd been using, but her original driver's license, kept hidden in a secret compartment all these years. Isabella Marie Reynolds stared out from the photograph, younger but unmistakable. Marcus took it carefully, studying the girl in the picture. "You were so young," he observed, noting the issue date, just months before she disappeared. 28 now," she said, managing a weak smile. "Though some days I feel ancient." She pulled out more items from her bag, a birth certificate, a trust fund document, even an old society page clipping, announcing her debutante ball. "I kept these. I don't know why. Maybe to remind myself it was all real, that I hadn't imagined. That life." The documents spread across the dashboard told a story of privilege and constraint. Marcus read them without comment, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he handed them back, handling them with the same respect he showed his own precious few possessions. "The night I left," Isabella continued, her voice stronger now, "I had everything planned. Took out cash in small amounts over months so it wouldn't raise flags. Learned how to disappear. It's surprisingly easy in a world that only sees what it expects to see. The hard part wasn't leaving, the hard part was staying gone." A police car cruised past their alley, its lights off, but its presence a reminder of the search that would soon intensify. Isabella watched it pass, but for the first time, she didn't feel the usual surge of panic. "I worked as a waitress first," she said, finding strange relief in finally telling her story. "Then a bookstore clerk, an office cleaner, anything that paid cash. Moved every few months, kept to myself. But I never left Seattle. Couldn't leave Dad alone in the city where Mom died." Marcus nodded, understanding the invisible tethers that kept people bound to places of memory. "You've been watching over him all these years, haven't you? Just from a different angle. From the shadows," she agreed. "I'd see him sometimes, at charity events I was cleaning up after, through windows of restaurants where I worked. He aged so much those first few years." She touched her mother's locket. "I think he understood, eventually, why I left." The press. Releases changed from missing heiress to just wanting to know I was safe. The morning traffic was picking up outside their alley, the city waking to news of her discovery. Soon, the quiet space they'd carved out would be invaded by the noise and demands of the world. But for now, in the gentle rain, there was just truth between them. "Last night," she said, "when you first picked me up at the gas station, I was actually on my way to see him." The admission surprised even her. "It's the anniversary, and I thought maybe it was time. Then I got scared, started walking in the rain instead. That's when you found me." Marcus reached for his logbook, but instead of writing, he pulled out the sketch she'd made of him at the diner. "Sometimes," he said, "we find what we need instead of what we're looking for." Isabella looked at her drawing, at how she'd captured not just Marcus's features, but the kindness in his eyes, the dignity that poverty hadn't touched. "I've been so afraid," she whispered. "Not of him, really. Of losing myself again. Of disappointing everyone again." "The person you've become," Marcus said gently, "the one who helps others, who sees beauty in forgotten places, who carries kindness like a light. That's not someone you need to lose. That's someone your father should meet." The rain drummed softly on the van's roof, a rhythm like time itself passing. Isabella took her old ID and carefully positioned it next to her current one. Two versions of herself, separated by years and experience, but maybe not as different as she'd thought. "Will you—" She hesitated, then found her courage. "Will you come with me when I go to see him?" Marcus looked at her, not at the heiress or the runaway, but at the woman who had shared his coffee and drawn his portrait and understood what it meant to choose freedom at any cost. "Sometimes," he said, "the bravest thing we can do is let someone walk beside us when we're afraid." The Reynolds Technology Building rose before them, like a monument to everything Isabella had left behind. Its glass surface reflected the clearing sky, each window a mirror showing fragments of the life she'd chosen to abandon. Marcus parked the van across the street, far enough away to avoid immediate notice, but close enough to see the growing media presence at the main entrance. Isabella's hands shook as she tried to write a note to her father. 3 crumpled attempts already lay at her feet, each one failing to capture what she needed to say. The 4th piece of paper bore just 2 lines. "Dad, I'm ready to talk, not about the past, but about who we are now." "It's not enough," she said, starting to crumple this one too. Marcus gently stopped her hand. "Sometimes the simplest words carry the most truth." She looked down at her clothes, clean but worn, chosen for a life of invisibility. "I can't walk in there looking like this. The media would have a field day. Billionaire's daughter returns in rags." "You look like someone who's lived honestly," Marcus said. "There's dignity in that." A sleek black car pulled up to the building's entrance, and Isabella recognized David Chen, her father's head of security, stepping out. He'd aged too, his hair now more silver than black. For a moment she was 18 again, watching him search for her through the city's streets, always a few steps behind. "Chen was kind to me," she said softly. "Even when he was looking for me, he never made me feel like a fugitive. I think he understood too." Her phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. Her father's new private line, she assumed. "Please come home, Bella. Whatever you need, however you need this to be." The old nickname hit her hard. Only her parents had ever called her Bella. She hadn't heard it in 10 years. "I don't know if I can be who he remembers," she confessed. To Marcus, maybe that's not what he's asking for anymore. Marcus pulled out his logbook, showing her an entry from the day before. "Gave shelter to a lost daughter who taught me that sometimes running away and finding home are the same journey." Isabella touched the words gently. "When did you write that?" "This morning while you were sleeping in the van. Been thinking about my own daughter, how sometimes love means letting people find their own way back." "You never told me you had a daughter." Marcus's eyes grew distant. "Lisa, she's in Portland now. We lost touch after the bankruptcy, my shame, keeping me from reaching out. But last year, she found me. Didn't try to fix everything, didn't ask me to be the father I used to be. Just wanted to know me as I am now." Isabella looked back at the building, at the office on the 40th floor, where she knew her father would be waiting. "And were you ready when she found you?" "Wasn't about being ready," he said quietly. "Was about realizing that love doesn't need us to be perfect, just present." She took out her sketchbook, flipping through the years of drawings, cityscapes, strangers' faces, and scattered throughout, almost hidden, pieces of her father's world. The building at Christmas, lights, glowing, her father's silhouette in his office window, the garden where her mother used to sit. "I've been drawing my way home all this time," she realized. "I just couldn't see it." A news van pulled up across the street, its satellite dish reaching toward the sky like a searching hand. Soon there would be more. The story of her return, drawing media like moths to flame. Isabella looked at Marcus, this unlikely guardian angel who had shown her what dignity really meant. "Will you walk in with me? Not hide in the background, but really with me?" "You sure? Might complicate your story." "My story stopped being simple the moment I left. Maybe it's time to let it be as complicated and beautiful as it really is." She folded her note carefully, tucking it into her pocket. Then, with deliberate care, she took out her mother's locket and fastened it around her neck, no longer hiding it, but wearing it proudly. "I'm ready," she said, surprising herself by meaning it. The news broke like a tsunami across Seattle's media landscape. Before Isabella and Marcus had even crossed the street, their images were already splashed across every local news website. Breaking: Reynolds' heiress found. Security cameras from the coffee shop had captured clear footage of their morning encounter, and Mrs. Parker's social media post had gone viral within hours. "Reynolds' return. Billionaire's daughter discovered living among Seattle's homeless," screamed one headline. Another read: "Missing heiress's guardian angel, the homeless veteran who helped her come home." They stood at the building's entrance, watching the crowd of reporters grow. Isabella felt Marcus's steady presence beside her, grateful for his quiet strength. Camera flashes exploded around them like lightning, questions hurled like rain. "Isabella, why did you leave? Miss Reynolds, where have you been?" "Sir, are you the homeless man who found her?" "Isabella, does your father know you're here?" Security guards formed a protective barrier around them, Chen directing the operation with practiced efficiency. "Miss Reynolds," he said formally, though his eyes held genuine warmth, "your father is waiting upstairs." The lobby fell silent as they entered, employees stopping to stare at the prodigal daughter's return. Isabella walked with her head high, Marcus matching her pace. Their reflections multiplied in the marble walls, the wealthy heiress in worn jeans, the homeless veteran in his clean but aged clothes, dignity wrapping them both like an invisible cloak. "They're going to try to twist this," Isabella murmured, as they waited for the elevator. "Make it sensational, make it ugly." "Let them," Marcus replied. "Truth has its own weight." Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Old friends, distant relatives, media outlets, all wanting a piece of the story. But one message stood out from her father. "I see you, Bella. Take your time. I'm here." The elevator rose smoothly toward the 40th floor. Through its glass walls, they watched Seattle spread out below them, the city where both had lost and found themselves. Isabella's hand found her mother's locket, drawing strength from its familiar weight. "Look," Marcus said softly, pointing to a newspaper someone had left in the elevator. The front page showed their photo from the coffee shop, but it wasn't the sensational headline that caught their attention. It was the image itself, Isabella and Marcus caught in a moment of genuine connection, his protective stance, her trust evident in her expression. Even through the grainy security camera footage, their humanity shone through. "Sometimes," Isabella said, "a picture tells the truth even when the words around it don't." The elevator chimed, announcing their arrival. Before the doors opened, Isabella turned to Marcus. "Whatever happens next, thank you. Not just for helping me come back, but for showing me that sometimes the longest way home is the truest." Marcus touched his St. Christopher medal. "Sometimes saints wear worn shoes instead of halos," he said with a gentle smile. "Your mother knew that, I think. That's why she gave you the locket, to remind you that love sees past appearances." The elevator doors opened to reveal a corridor lined with familiar art, pieces her mother had chosen years ago. At the end, her father's office waited. But now, standing on the threshold of her old life, Isabella felt different. She wasn't returning as the daughter who had fled, but as the woman who had chosen to come home. Through the windows, they could see more news vans arriving, their satellite dishes raising like curious heads. Seattle's biggest story in years was unfolding. But the real story wasn't in the headlines or viral posts. It was in the quiet space between two people who had lost everything and found something more valuable, the courage to be seen for who they truly were. James Reynolds stood at his office window, his back to the door, when Isabella entered. 10 years of imagining this moment hadn't prepared him for its reality. He turned slowly, taking in his daughter's appearance, not with judgment, but with the hungry eyes of a father who had missed a decade of his child's life. "Bella," he said softly, using the nickname that had gone unspoken for so long. Isabella stood in the doorway, Marcus a steady presence behind her. The office looked exactly as she remembered, the same mahogany desk, the same view of Seattle's skyline, the same photo of her mother on the credenza. But her father had changed. His hair was mostly silver now, his face lined with years of worry. "Dad," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. They moved toward each other with the cautious grace of long-separated dancers finding their rhythm. Again, when they embraced, it wasn't the polished greeting of their old life, but something raw and real. A father and daughter breaking through years of silence. "I'm sorry," they both said at once, then laughed softly through tears. James pulled back to look at his daughter, really look at her. "You're so like your mother now," he said. She would have understood. She always understood you better than I did. Isabella touched her locket. "I never took it off. Her last gift, I know." He gestured to the security footage playing silently. On his computer screen, the coffee shop scene from that morning. "Mr. Chen has been showing me everything, including," he turned to Marcus, who had remained respectfully by the door, "how this gentleman has been watching over you." Marcus stepped forward, his bearing straight despite the obvious contrast between his worn clothes and the luxurious office. "Your daughter showed me kindness first, sir. Everything else just followed naturally." James studied the man who had helped bring his daughter home. "You're Marcus Howard, Vietnam veteran, former contractor, lost everything in the 2008 crash." At their surprised looks, he added, "I had Mr. Chen run a background check as soon as the coffee shop footage came in. Old habits." Instead of being offended, Marcus nodded with understanding. A father's duty doesn't stop just because his child is grown. Something passed between the two men then, a recognition of different kinds of love, different ways of protecting what mattered. James gestured to the sitting area of his office. "Please, both of you sit. We have so much to talk about." As they settled into the leather chairs, Isabella noticed how Marcus maintained his dignity, even in these unfamiliar surroundings. He sat as if he belonged there, not through any pretense, but through the simple fact of knowing his own worth. "I've seen you," Isabella said suddenly to her father, "all these years. At charity events, through restaurant windows, I was never far." James's hands trembled slightly. "I felt you sometimes. Would catch glimpses of someone who looked like you, but by the time I turned, I thought I was imagining things. You weren't." She pulled out her sketchbook, showing him the drawings she'd made over the years. His building, his car, him. "I couldn't leave completely. Mom was here." "And now," he asked quietly, "are you staying?" The question hung in the air, heavy with hope and fear. Isabella looked at Marcus, drawing strength from his presence. "I'm not the daughter who left," she said carefully. "I can't be her again." "I don't want you to be," James replied, surprising her. "That was my mistake before, trying to make you into someone you weren't, someone I thought your mother wanted you to be. But she," his voice caught, "she would have been proud of you, Bella, of your strength, your independence, of the woman you've become." Through the windows, they could see the media circus growing below. Soon, they would have to face it, craft statements, handle the public's insatiable curiosity. But for now, in this quiet office, three people from very different worlds were finding common ground in the simple truth of who they had become. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the office as James Reynolds pulled up the security footage from the previous night. On the screen, they watched Marcus's van pull into the gas station, the moment Isabella stepped into its shelter, their shared time at the diner, the quiet park visit, all captured by the city's network of cameras that Chen had pieced together. "You knew the city's blind spots," James said, a note of admiration in his voice. "All these years, you stayed just out of sight." "I learned to live between the frames," Isabella replied, "the spaces people don't think to look." Marcus watched the footage with professional interest. "Your security team is thorough," he observed. "They tracked us within hours." James nodded. "Mr. Chen has been invaluable, though I suspect he knew more than he let on sometimes." He looked at his daughter. "He would occasionally mention homeless shelters, soup kitchens, places he thought I should direct more of our charitable giving." Isabella smiled softly. "He caught glimpses of me over the years. Never directly approached, just made sure certain places got the help they needed." "Speaking of help," James said, turning to Marcus, "I understand you've been doing odd jobs to survive. Your contracting experience, your military background, they shouldn't go to waste." Marcus straightened slightly. "Sir, if you're offering—" "Charity! Not charity," James interrupted. "Opportunity. Our foundation needs someone who understands both sides of the street, someone who can help us do more than just throw money at problems." Isabella watched the interplay between these two proud men, her father learning to offer help without control, Marcus maintaining dignity while accepting opportunity. Something was shifting in the room's dynamics, like sun breaking through storm clouds. "I have conditions," Marcus said carefully. James raised an eyebrow but nodded for him to continue. "I keep my van, at least for now, and I want to structure any program we develop around dignity, not dependence. Help that honors the strength people already have. The way you helped me," Isabella added softly. James studied the man before him. Not the homeless veteran society might see, but the person who had protected his daughter, who had helped her find her way home on her own terms. "I think," he said slowly, "that's exactly what our foundation needs." He turned to his computer, pulling up a draft of a press release Chen had prepared. "The media's already running wild with speculation. We need to control the narrative before it controls us." Isabella tensed, but Marcus's steady presence helped her stay calm. "What are they saying?" "Everything from kidnapping theories to hidden romances," James replied, his tone disapproving. "But maybe we can turn this into something meaningful." He began typing, speaking as he wrote. "The Reynolds Foundation announces a new initiative focusing on dignity-based assistance for Seattle's homeless population, headed by Marcus Howard, whose recent actions reminded us that kindness and understanding transcend social boundaries. "Dad," Isabella said, surprised, "that's perfect." "I've learned something about letting go of control," James replied, glancing at her, "about trusting people to find their own way." Marcus touched his St. Christopher medal thoughtfully. "A foundation built on real understanding. It could make a difference." "It already has," Isabella said, pulling out her sketchbook. She flipped to a fresh page and began drawing. Her father at his desk, Marcus standing proud despite his worn clothes, the Seattle skyline behind them, different worlds beginning to bridge. Through the windows they could see the media vans, still circling below, but their presence seemed less threatening now. They had a story to tell, but it would be their story, not of a lost heiress found, but of how three people from different walks of life had helped each other find something more valuable than wealth or status. James watched his daughter sketch, seeing echoes of her mother in the way she captured not just images, but feelings on paper. "Your mother," he said quietly. "She always said art was how you saw the world most clearly. I should have listened." "We can listen now?" Isabella replied, adding detail to Marcus's eyes, capturing the dignity that no hardship had erased. "All of us." 1 month later, Marcus stood in front of a small apartment building in a quiet neighborhood of Seattle. The keys felt strange in his hand. Not borrowed, not temporary, but his. The building itself was modest by Reynolds' standards, but to Marcus, it represented something he'd almost forgotten, a home of his own. Isabella stood beside him, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. She'd been documenting everything lately, the Foundation's first meetings, Marcus's transition from the streets, her own journey back into the world. But this moment felt particularly significant. "Ready?" she asked, watching him study the building. "Almost," he replied, reaching into his van. He emerged with his logbook, worn and familiar. "One last entry here before starting a new one." She watched as he wrote, "Found home again, not just a place, but a purpose. Thank you, St. Christopher." The apartment was small but well-maintained, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Marcus had insisted on paying rent, reduced, but not free. His new position at the Reynolds Foundation provided a salary that made it possible, while still letting him maintain his independence. "The van stays," he said, more to himself than to Isabella. She nodded, understanding. "Dad said you could park it right here, and the Foundation can use it for outreach work." Marcus smiled, touching the St. Christopher medal that still hung. "And from its rearview mirror, from shelter to service, feels right." Isabella opened her sketchbook, adding the van to her drawing of the building. Over the past month, her art had taken on new purpose. The Foundation was using her sketches in their materials, raw, honest depictions of street life that captured both struggle and dignity. "Have you seen today's paper?" she asked, pulling it from her bag. The article was positive. Reynolds Foundation launches revolutionary homeless program. The photo showed Marcus in a suit, borrowed from James for the press conference, but standing proud next to his van, which had become a symbol of their unique approach. "Your father's learning," Marcus observed. "The program's really helping people maintain their dignity while getting back on their feet." "He's learning from you," Isabella corrected. "We all are." Her own life had found a new rhythm. She'd moved into a modest apartment nearby, not the penthouse her father had offered, but a space that felt truly hers. Her sketches were gaining recognition in their own right, telling stories of the city's forgotten corners with newfound purpose. "Lisa's coming to visit next week," Marcus said, referring to his daughter. "Said she wants to see what her old man's been up to." Isabella smiled, remembering how Marcus's story about reconnecting with his daughter had given her the courage to face her own father. "Family finds its way back," she said softly. They carried Marcus's few belongings up to the apartment. His carefully maintained clothes, his tools, his logbook. Each item found its place, not as symbols of poverty now, but as reminders of a journey that had led here. The last box contained something new, A framed photo from the foundation's opening day. Marcus and Isabella stood with James, all three smiling, genuine and unposed. Behind them, the van was visible, its St. Christopher medal catching the light. "Perfect spot for this," Marcus said, placing it on a shelf near the window. Isabella looked around the apartment. Simple, dignified, home. "You know," she said, "when you picked me up that night, I thought I was just getting a ride." Marcus smiled, understanding all she wasn't saying. Sometimes the best journeys don't take us where we expected to go. Through the window they could see Seattle spreading out before them, the city that had been both hiding place and home. But now its streets held different meaning, not escape routes, but paths forward. Not places to get lost, but ways to help others find their way. 1 year later, Marcus's van sat in the same spot where he had first offered Isabella shelter from the storm. The gas station hadn't changed much, but everything else had. Now, the van served as a mobile office for the Reynolds Foundation's street outreach program, its interior thoughtfully modified, but still maintaining its humble character. Isabella sat in the passenger seat, her sketchbook open to a new drawing. This one showed Marcus talking with a young man outside a shelter, both figures rendered with the careful dignity that had become her artistic signature. Her work now hung in galleries across Seattle, telling stories of transformation and hope through the faces of those society often overlooked. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Marcus said, adjusting the St. Christopher medal that still hung. From the mirror, "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Isabella replied, adding final touches to her sketch. "Other times, it feels like a different lifetime." They were waiting for James to arrive. Their weekly dinner tradition had started awkwardly, but had grown into something they all treasured: father, daughter, and the man who had helped bridge their worlds. Today was special, though. Today they were celebrating. A sleek car pulled up beside them, and James stepped out, carrying a familiar leather-bound book. "Found it in your mother's things," he said, handing it to Isabella. "Thought today was the right time." It was her mother's journal, filled with sketches much like Isabella's own. "She saw beauty in unexpected places too," James added softly. They walked together to the small diner where Marcus and Isabella had first shared coffee. Betty was still there, her smile warm with recognition. The booth they chose offered a view of both the street and the kitchen, a perspective that bridged different worlds, just as they had. Marcus pulled out his logbook, not the old one, which was now carefully preserved, but a new volume dedicated to the Foundation's work. Each entry still recorded kindnesses given and received, but now they told stories of systemic change, of lives transformed through dignity-based assistance. "The new shelter opens next week," he reported, showing them the latest statistics. "Already have 15 people signed up for the job training program." James nodded with pride. The Reynolds Foundation had been transformed under Marcus's guidance, its approach to helping the homeless now a model for other cities. "The mayor called yesterday," he said, "wants to expand the program citywide." Isabella smiled, remembering the press conference where Marcus had first presented their vision. He'd worn a suit then, but kept his van keys clipped to his belt. Reminder that authenticity mattered more than appearances. "Lisa's doing great with the youth outreach program," she added, referring to Marcus's daughter, who had joined the foundation 6 months ago. "She has your gift for seeing past surfaces." Their food arrived, the same simple fare they'd shared that first night, but now it tasted of celebration rather than uncertainty. Betty refused payment, as always. "On the house for my favorite success story," she insisted. As they ate, Isabella opened her mother's journal, gasping softly at what she found. There, dated just months before her death, was a sketch of this very diner with a note in her elegant hand. "Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as ordinary moments. Remember to look for angels in unexpected places." "Mom knew," she whispered. "She understood about needing to find your own way." James touched the journal gently. "She taught me too, though it took me longer to learn. Sometimes love means letting go enough for people to find their way back. Marcus added a new entry to his logbook, 1-year anniversary of finding family, in all its forms. Below it, he tucked the latest newspaper clipping about their work, headline reading, Reynolds Foundation revolutionizes homeless assistance. Dignity First Approach shows remarkable success. Through the diner's windows, they could see the city changing in the evening light. Seattle had been their hiding place, their challenge, and finally their home, not despite their differences, but because of how those differences had helped them see the world more clearly. The St. Christopher Medal caught the last rays of sun, throwing golden light across their table. In its glow, 3 people who had once been lost in different ways shared a meal and a purpose, having found in each other the family they never expected, but somehow always needed. To unexpected journeys, Marcus proposed, raising his coffee cup, and to finding home, Isabella added, touching her mother's locket. To both, James finished, understanding finally that sometimes the longest road was the truest way home. Outside, Marcus's van stood ready for another day of outreach work. Its presence, a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of love come disguised as simple offers of shelter from the storm.